Welcome to the War Files Hub, where we tell the stories of wars. Picture a king in France making a plan to make a prince from Austria the new king of Mexico. It sounds silly, like the start of a serious and funny movie. But in the middle of the 1800s, it was very serious. The fight we call the Franco-Mexican War was about the desire for power, a fight over money, and a clash of ideas. And yet, for most people outside of Mexico, it is not as well known as other big wars of that time. Today, you can still find reminders of it in surprising places, like the yearly celebration of Cinco de Mayo. This holiday is often mistaken for Mexican Independence Day. But before we get to that battle, we have to go back in time to understand how such a weird war could even start. This was not the first time France and Mexico had fought. Just 20 years before, French soldiers had already come to Mexico during the Pastry War. That fight was started by a French baker in Mexico City who said he was owed money. That earlier fight ended fast, but it left behind hurt feelings and problems that were not solved. For Napoleon III, who was the nephew of the great Napoleon Bonaparte and the ruler of France, Mexico was not just some faraway country in trouble. It was a perfect place to show off his power, bring back the greatness of France, and maybe change the power of countries across the Atlantic Ocean. On the outside, the reason for the war was simple. Mexico owed them money. Mexico had borrowed a lot of money from countries in Europe, and it did not look like they could pay it back because of their own civil war. Britain, Spain, and France all had good reasons to be upset. But Napoleon saw a chance where others just saw a money problem. His goals were much bigger than just getting paid back. He dreamed of putting a European king in the Americas to create a powerful Catholic empire. This empire could balance out the growing power of the Protestant United States. And so, in the early 1860s, while the United States was busy with its own civil war, French ships sailed to Veracruz. What started as a team effort between Europe's big countries would soon break apart and become a risky plan by France. A risky plan that would pull in not just armies and generals, but kings, princes, and one of Mexico's toughest leaders, Benito Juárez. The Franco-Mexican War was never going to be a simple fight between armies. It was a war of clashing goals between a European king looking for fame, a Mexican republic fighting to survive, and a prince who was tricked by a dream of his own greatness. To understand how a man from Vienna, Austria, ended up wearing Mexico's crown, and why his rule fell apart so badly, we must start with Mexico itself. It was a country already broken by big disagreements long before French soldiers ever arrived. When French ships finally showed up off Mexico's coast, they were sailing toward a country that was already torn apart. Between 1857 and 1861, Mexico had been in the middle of the War of Reform. This was a civil war that was less about land and more about what kind of country Mexico should be. On one side were the conservatives, who wanted to keep the old ways of doing things. They supported the Catholic Church, which owned huge amounts of land and was very rich and powerful in Mexico. To them, the church was not just for religion, but was the most important part of society. They also wanted a strong central government, with order being more important than freedom, because they thought Mexico could only survive if the rich and powerful were in charge. On the other side were the liberals, who were inspired by ideas of democracy, fairness, and a modern country free from the church's control. They were lawyers, smart people, and reformers who believed Mexico's future was in schools that were not run by the church, in breaking the church's control over money, and in giving power to regular people. To them, the special rights of priests and rich people were like chains holding Mexico back from moving forward. This was more than just a fight between different political plans. It was a civil war between two different dreams for the country. Whole towns were split over these ideas. In villages, priests told people to defend their faith, while liberal leaders promised them freedom from unfair treatment. Native communities, who had been treated badly by both the church and the government, were wanted by both sides, but were often let down by each one. The fight was terrible and happened all over the country, in mountains, on plains, and in cities. Families were torn apart, riches were lost, and Mexico's already weak economy was destroyed. By 1861, after 4 years of bloody fighting, the liberals, led by Benito Juárez, had won. Juárez, a Zapotec man from Oaxaca who grew up poor and became president, was a perfect example of the liberal idea of success based on skill, not on who you were born to. His victory was a sign of strength, a native man leading a country that was determined to become modern. But winning had a cost. The conservatives had been beaten, but they still had a lot of power and friends. The church was angry about everything it had lost, and Mexico had no money left because of the long war. Juárez had brought peace, but he was now in charge of a country that was hurt, distrustful, and weak. It was a nation where the last bits of the Civil War were still glowing, ready to catch fire again. By the time Benito Juárez won in 1861, the fighting had stopped. But the quiet was misleading. The Reform War had left Mexico not peaceful, but in ruins. Cities had the marks of long battles. Farms were not being taken care of, and a whole generation of young men had been lost in the Civil War. The country Juárez was now leading was both tired and open to attack. The biggest problem was money. To pay for their armies, both the liberals and the conservatives had borrowed a lot of money from other countries. Loans came from Britain, Spain, and France, and each country wanted to protect its money in the New World. But now that the conservatives were defeated, the lenders wanted the liberals to pay back not only their own loans, but also the loans of their enemies. To Juárez, this seemed crazy. Why should a weak country, barely staying together, have to pay for the mistakes of the enemies it just beat? But to Europe, a debt was a debt. The country's bank, however, was almost empty. The money coming in had dropped during the war. Trading had slowed down, and silver, which was the main source of Mexico's wealth, was now owned by other countries. Juárez made the hard choice to stop paying back the loans for 2 years so the country could get stable. For regular Mexicans, this break was needed to survive. Teachers needed to be paid, soldiers needed their money, and families needed help after years of destruction. But to the kings and queens of Europe, Juárez's decision looked like he was being disrespectful. At the same time, Mexican society was struggling because of unfairness. Richness was still held by a few landowners and the church, even though the liberals were trying to change that. Poor farmers in the countryside, native communities, and city workers still had very hard lives. Many were stuck in a cycle of owing money that was almost like being a slave. For them, the promises of the liberal victory felt far away and not real. They were just words spoken in government buildings while their families were hungry. The war had also hurt Mexico's reputation in other countries. To people in Europe, it looked like a country that could not rule itself, going from one problem to the next. Newspapers in Paris and London described Mexico as unstable, a country always about to fall apart. For people like Napoleon III, who were looking for an opportunity, these stories gave them a reason to step in. If Mexico could not handle its own problems, maybe it needed help from Europe. So, even after winning, Juárez was in a very difficult spot. His government was the real one. His ideas were good. But his enemies were not gone. They were planning a comeback from other countries, whispering about taking back power. And across the Atlantic Ocean, powerful nations were watching, thinking, and getting ready to do something. When Juárez announced that Mexico would stop paying its debts in 1861, the news traveled all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. In the royal courts and government offices of Europe, his decision was not seen as a smart move to help his country survive. It was seen as a challenge. To kings and their helpers, Mexico was a borrower that was refusing to pay what it owed. To bankers, it was a bad example that others might follow. And to Napoleon III, it was an opportunity. Within a few months, Britain, Spain, and France teamed up. Officially, their goal was simple: to make Mexico pay them back and to protect their citizens living there. In reality, each country had its own plans. British business owners wanted to protect their trade and the money they had invested. Spain, missing its old empire, saw a chance to get some power back in the place it used to rule. And France, led by Napoleon III, had plans that were much bigger than money. In December 1861, European ships appeared off the Gulf Coast. At Veracruz, the sight of warships with 3 different flags made the people of Mexico very nervous. The city, which was already hurt from years of war, got ready for an invasion. When the soldiers got off the ships, Spanish Marines in clean uniforms, British soldiers in red coats, and French soldiers in blue jackets, it was clear that Mexico was once again being used for other countries' plans. At first, Juárez's government tried to talk with them. After all, Mexico was not strong enough to fight three big countries at once. The talks led to the London Convention, an agreement that was supposed to make sure the countries would only be involved in collecting money. On paper, this sounded good. But in reality, people were very suspicious. Could these powerful countries really stop themselves from trying to take more than just money? For Britain and Spain, the answer soon became yes. As their leaders talked with the French, they realized that Napoleon's plans were much bigger than the loans. He did not just want to collect money. He wanted to change Mexico itself. The plan, which had been whispered about in his palace in Paris, was now coming out. He wanted to set up a kingdom in the Americas with a European ruler, a Catholic empire to challenge the growing power of the United States. Britain, being careful and not wanting to make Washington angry, backed out. Spain, even though it was tempted at first, also did not want to be a small part of France's big plans. Within months, both countries took their soldiers and left, leaving Napoleon all by himself, but also free to do what he wanted. What started as a team of European lenders turned into a risky plan by France, one that would soon pull Mexico into another war. When Britain and Spain left, their ships disappearing over the Atlantic horizon, Napoleon III stayed. For him, Mexico was never about money. It was about his big plans. In Paris, the Emperor of France saw himself as following in Napoleon Bonaparte's footsteps. He thought he was a ruler who could make France great again by changing the world outside of Europe. Mexico was going to be his big project. The United States was busy, torn apart by its own civil war. For Napoleon, this was the perfect time. If America had announced the Monroe Doctrine, which said that no European country should get involved in the Americas, what better time to challenge it than when the country was fighting itself at battles like Antietam and Gettysburg? France could take what the Americans could not protect. But taking over a country just for the sake of it was risky. To make his plan look right, Napoleon needed a king who could be seen as the proper ruler of Mexico. He looked to the House of Habsburg, a royal family whose history in the New World went back to the time of the Spanish Empire. There in Vienna lived a young prince, Maximilian, the younger brother of Austria's emperor. Maximilian was a dreamer. He was tall, handsome, and loved art and culture. He had grown up in palaces but was strangely interested in ideas about fair government and doing his duty like a knight. He dreamed of being more than just a backup prince in Vienna. To the Mexican monarchists, the defeated conservatives who wanted a king to bring stability, Maximilian looked like a hero. To Napoleon, he looked like the perfect puppet king. But there was a problem with this choice. Maximilian's ideas, his belief in shorter work hours, ending forced labor, and helping society, were much closer to Juárez's liberal plans than to the ideas of the conservatives who were asking him to come. But that problem would be dealt with later. For now, the plan was moving forward. Napoleon's helpers promised Maximilian that Mexico wanted him, that its people were asking for a king, and that a throne was waiting for him if he was brave enough to take it. Reports were made to sound better than they were, requests were faked, and votes were made up. The truth, that most of Mexico was strongly against having a king, was ignored. In 1862, while Napoleon was whispering promises to Maximilian, French soldiers were already moving into the country. Veracruz had been taken, and the roads to the capital were open. But Mexico, even though it was broken and tired, would not just give up. Napoleon's secret plan was about to run into the strength of a people who refused to be ruled by a faraway king. On a foggy December morning in 1861, ships appeared on the horizon off the coast of Veracruz. As the sun rose, the people of the old port city watched 3 European flags waving in the sea breeze: Spain, Britain, and France. The team of countries had arrived. They landed quickly and did not face much of a fight. Veracruz, tired from years of fighting, could not find the strength to stop them. About 6,000 European soldiers came ashore: Spanish Marines, well-trained British redcoats, and French soldiers in their dark blue jackets and red pants. On the Mexican side, they could only gather about 3,000 men, and their weapons were a mix of old muskets, old cannons, and rifles left over from the Civil War. With fewer soldiers and worse weapons, they moved back instead of getting destroyed. As the Europeans moved inland, they easily captured 3 towns. To people watching from far away, it seemed like Mexico would fall apart quickly. Reports sent back to Europe described a messy republic, with soldiers who were not fed well and officers who had lost hope. Napoleon's government helpers were sure of themselves. They thought Mexico could be taken with very little fighting and that Maximilian's throne would soon be ready. But under this easy victory was a different truth. Veracruz was not all of Mexico. Behind the hills and plains, people were getting ready to fight back, not just with the strength of armies, but with pride and determination. The Mexican people, still hurt by the Reform War, were sure that they would not trade their own country's problems for being ruled by another country. In early 1862, more soldiers arrived from France. This time, they had a different goal. The excuse of just collecting money started to disappear. A new French commander, General Charles de Lorenzes, took over. His orders were not to talk, but to conquer. Veracruz was only the first step. From there, the French wanted to take Puebla, and after that, the heart of the country, Mexico City. At first, the European teams seemed to be working together, their flags waving side by side as their soldiers marched inland. But behind this show of teamwork, problems were already starting. Britain and Spain had come to Mexico for a simple reason: get their money back, protect their citizens, and go home. France, on the other hand, had no plans to leave. As the weeks went by, it became clear to the British and Spanish leaders that Napoleon III's plans were much bigger than the agreements made in London. French officers talked less about getting money back and more about changing Mexico's government. Rumors went around that Paris planned to put a European prince on the throne. What was supposed to be a small action was turning into something much more dangerous: a plan to make Mexico a colony in the Americas. Britain was the first to back away. London did not want to get into a mess that might make the United States angry. Even though it was busy with its own civil war, America had always stood by its Monroe Doctrine, which said that the Americas were not for European empires to take. To challenge it directly was to risk a fight once the United States was back together. For Britain, Mexico was not worth a fight with Washington. Spain, too, saw that it was a bad idea. Madrid had dreamed of getting some of its power back in its old colony, but being a small partner to France in a risky plan did not sound good. Spanish soldiers started getting ready to leave. By the spring of 1862, both Spain and Britain had signed papers to leave and had sailed for home. And so, on Mexican land, only one flag was left. The tricolor flag of France now stood alone, no longer protected by friends, no longer held back by rules. Napoleon's risky plan had taken off its friendly mask. What started as a group mission had turned into a solo mission, driven by one man's dream of an empire. For Mexico, this was both a good thing and a bad thing. With Spain and Britain gone, the fight was smaller, but it also left the country face to face with France, a powerful nation determined to make Mexico do what it wanted. The next step would show if Napoleon's big plans could survive the reality of Mexican resistance. With Britain and Spain gone, General Charles de Lorenzes marched deeper into Mexico, carrying Napoleon's dreams on his shoulders. His army of about 6,000 men was well-trained, modern, and sure of itself. The French army had beaten powerful countries all over Europe. Why should a broken country, still weak from a civil war, be any different? Lorenzes' soldiers moved through the valleys and plains, easily pushing aside small groups of local soldiers and scattering poorly armed fighters. To the French officers, this seemed to prove what they already thought: Mexico would fall with the first push. But how easy it was also made them too proud. Reports were sent back to Paris saying that a quick victory was coming and that French soldiers would soon be marching in a parade through Mexico City. But Mexico was not an empty land. Behind the hills and villages, General Ignacio Zaragoza, the leader of the Army of the East, was getting ready. His army was smaller, with just under 4,500 men, and did not have good weapons. But what they did not have in numbers, they had in determination. Zaragoza was young, only 33, but his calm leadership gave his soldiers confidence. Many of them were farmers and native fighters who had never been far from their homes. As Lawrences moved inland, small fights broke out. Small groups of Mexican horse soldiers attacked French lines, striking from behind hills before disappearing into the countryside. These fights were small, but they meant a lot. Mexico would not give up without a fight. The land itself seemed to be fighting back, the rough ground, the hot sun, and the long supply line that went all the way back to Veracruz. By late April 1862, the French army reached the valley of Puebla, a city on the road to Mexico City. Whoever controlled Puebla controlled the way to the capital. Zaragoza placed his men on the high ground looking over the city, making the hills of Loreto and Guadalupe stronger. His army waited behind their homemade defenses, determined to hold their ground. For Lawrences, Puebla looked like just another thing in his way. Sure that the French were better, he decided to attack the hills head-on. The battle that came next would surprise everyone and be remembered in history as the day Mexico, against all expectations, stood strong. On the morning of May 5, 1862, storm clouds gathered over Puebla. General Zaragoza's men stood behind their dirt walls, with muskets ready and feeling nervous. Across the plain, Lawrences' 6,000 French soldiers marched forward with the confidence of soldiers who had beaten Europe's strongest armies. To them, this was going to be a quick and easy victory. The French attacked from the north, climbing the hills toward the forts of Loreto and Guadalupe. But the Mexicans, even though there were fewer of them and they had worse weapons, held their ground. Cannons boomed from the hilltops, making holes in the French lines. Twice, Lawrences ordered new attacks, bringing in more soldiers and even trying to attack from the side from the east. Twice, the Mexicans pushed them back. Mud from the rain slowed the French down, while the defenders, fighting on land they knew well, did not give up. By the afternoon, Lawrences pushed for a third attack, but his cannons were dangerously low on bullets. When the drums beat and the bugles played, the French soldiers rushed forward without the cover of cannon fire, straight into a storm of musket shots from above. This last attack fell apart into chaos. Then came Zaragoza's counterattack. Mexican horse soldiers charged from both sides, their swords flashing, while foot soldiers rushed down the hills. The French line broke under the attack, and what started as a well-ordered march turned into a retreat. Lawrences' army stumbled back across the plain, leaving hundreds of dead and wounded soldiers. Against all expectations, Mexico had won. A poorly armed army of 4,500 had beaten one of Europe's best professional armies. The victory did not end the war. More French soldiers would soon return. But it was very exciting. Across Mexico, the news spread like a wildfire. It was a symbol of standing up for themselves, proof that foreign invaders could be beaten. And so, Cinco de Mayo became a part of history. Outside of Mexico, it is often mistaken for Independence Day. In truth, it celebrated something different, a moment when bravery and determination beat impossible odds. It was when a weak country reminded the world that it would not bow down easily to an empire. For Napoleon III, Puebla was an embarrassment. For Juárez and the Republic, it was a reason to keep fighting. The war was far from over, but on that day, under stormy skies, Mexico had written a story of pride that is still remembered today. The loss at Puebla shocked Paris. How could Napoleon III's proud army, the winners at Magenta and Solferino, be beaten by a smaller force of farmers and quickly trained fighters? For Napoleon, giving up was not an option. His reputation, his dream of an empire, and even the trust people had in France were all at stake. He decided to go back not with a small group of soldiers, but with an army that would crush Mexico's resistance for good. In early 1863, General Elia Frederick Faury took over from Lawrences. Unlike the commander before him, Faury was careful and planned things out. He did not make quick attacks. He arrived at Veracruz with a huge army. Nearly 26,000 soldiers came with him, along with cannons, engineers, and supplies for a long fight. For Mexico, this was no longer a small attack. It was an invasion. Faury marched toward Puebla again. This time, Zaragoza was gone. He had died from sickness just months after his big win. His death left a big hole. Still, Mexican defenders were ready, digging trenches and making their positions stronger. But they were facing a siege like nothing they had seen before. Starting in March 1863, the French surrounded Puebla. For 2 long and hard months, the city became a place of hunger, sickness, and constant bombing. Shells crashed into homes and churches, turning whole parts of the city into piles of broken stone. Food ran out. The defenders carefully shared every last bit. Women and children carried water while under fire, and priests blessed the dead in small chapels among the ruins. Several desperate tries to get help failed as the Republic soldiers outside the city were pushed back. Inside Puebla, hope slowly faded. Some defenders snuck out at night to attack French lines. Others died in desperate attacks that did not achieve much. At last, with no supplies left and thousands of people sick or hurt, the soldiers surrendered in May 1863. This time, the French flag did not retreat. French soldiers marched proudly into the broken city. The road to Mexico City was now open. Juárez, refusing to give up, ordered the government to leave the capital. On June 7, 1863, French soldiers entered the heart of Mexico. For Napoleon III, it was a victory. For Mexico, it was the start of a new and darker time, being occupied by a foreign army. When Puebla fell in May 1863, the road to the capital was wide open. Juárez, who was always practical, understood the danger. To stay in Mexico City would mean being captured, maybe even killed, and the symbolic death of the Republic. On May 31, he and his government left the city, taking the country's fragile government with them as they rode north toward Chihuahua. It was a desperate trip into the mountains, but Juárez knew that as long as he was alive, the Republic was alive too. A week later, on June 7, 1863, the French entered Mexico City. Soldiers in blue and red marched through streets that had once been filled with cheers for independence. The capital's big squares were filled with French flags. The city's rich families, who had long supported the conservative side, welcomed the invaders with big parties and events. To them, the French were not an embarrassment, but a rescue, a promise of order, stability, and the return of the old way of life that they believed the liberals had destroyed. But under all the parades, there was tension. Ordinary people watched in silence, worried about this new empire growing in their country. For many, having foreign soldiers there was not stability, but an insult, a reminder that Mexico's freedom was being sold to the highest bidder. For Napoleon III, the fall of Mexico City was a great success. At last, his risky plan seemed to be working. With the capital taken, it was time to turn the occupation into an empire. He needed a crown, a king who could make this takeover look right. And across the ocean in the palaces of Vienna, a prince who was not sure about the plan was being convinced that a great future was waiting for him in the New World. In Vienna, far from the dust and bullets of Mexico, a young Habsburg prince walked through marble rooms like a dreamer. Archduke Ferdinand Maximilian, the younger brother of Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria, was tall, classy, and well-educated. He loved art, collected rare plants, and talked about making fair changes to the government. But under his fancy appearance was a person who was not satisfied, a man who wanted a purpose beyond being the extra prince in a family of emperors. It was to this man that Napoleon's helpers came, carrying promises that looked shiny and wonderful. They told Maximilian that Mexico wanted him, that its people were asking for a king to fix their problems. Requests, many of which were faked or forced, were shown as proof that everyone supported him. A carefully planned vote claimed that huge numbers of people wanted him to rule. In truth, most Mexicans had never been asked. But Maximilian, who always wanted to believe in good causes, was convinced. Still, he was not sure. He was not foolish about the dangers. His wife, Carlotta of Belgium, who was the daughter of King Leopold I, pushed him to take the crown. She was ambitious and smart about politics and saw Mexico as a place where she and her husband could be great, away from the shadow of Vienna. Together, they imagined themselves as smart rulers, bringing progress to a faraway land. Napoleon made the offer better with promises. French soldiers would protect the empire. Mexican conservatives would support him. and Europe would accept his throne. Maximilian's liberal ideas, his belief in ending forced labor, in limiting the church's power, and in supporting education, were not seen as problems, but as good things that could make Mexico modern under an emperor's rule. What was ignored, of course, was the conflict. His changes would make the very conservative rich people who had invited him angry. In October 1863, after months of being convinced and praised, Maximilian accepted the Mexican crown. He would not sail right away, but the decision was made. The son of Europe's most famous royal family would cross the ocean to rule a nation that had not asked for him, put on a throne by foreign soldiers. As he stood on the balcony of his palace in Trieste, looking toward the Adriatic Sea, maybe Maximilian pictured himself as a bridge between the old world and the new. What he could not see was the storm waiting for him in the mountains of Mexico, where the Republicans were getting ready to fight, and poor farmers whispered that a foreign emperor would never rule their land. When Maximilian finally arrived in Mexico in 1864, the trip itself felt like a huge success. French soldiers stood along the roads. Cannons boomed in his honor. And in Mexico City, parades were held to welcome the new emperor and his wife, Empress Carlotta. To many conservatives, it seemed their long-awaited dream had come true. A king was back, approved by Europe, standing under the golden decorations of an empire. But Maximilian was not a normal king. He was taught in the liberal ways of mid-1800s Europe, and believed a ruler's job was not just to keep order, but to help his people. He shocked his conservative supporters almost right away. He ended peonage, the system that was almost like slavery and kept farmers in debt to their landlords forever. He limited work hours, stopped child labor, and supported schools that were not run by the church. He tried to bring science, modern factories, and a government service based on skill to Mexico. For the poor and overlooked, these changes offered hope. But they came with a big problem. Maximilian had his throne because of Mexico's conservatives, and these very changes made them angry. The rich landowners, the church leaders, and the old powerful families felt betrayed. They had invited a king to bring back their special rights, not take them away. To the liberals, meanwhile, Maximilian was still an invader, a European prince put in power by foreign soldiers, no matter how good his ideas were. Carlotta, who strongly believed in her husband's vision, became his closest helper. She wrote letters asking European courts to support the empire, traveled around the country with royal confidence, and spoke with passion about Mexico's great future under their smart rule. But even she could not hide the problems at the center of their rule. Maximilian dreamed of being a king who made things better in a land torn by war. But every law he passed and every order he signed seemed to make one side angry without making the other side loyal. The conservatives were filled with anger. The liberals got ready to fight back harder. Between them stood an emperor who was hopeful enough to believe he could bring Mexico together, but who was blind to the fact that both sides saw him as something in the way of their own true dream for the country. It was a situation too weak to last. Even though French soldiers still guarded his throne, Maximilian's empire was built on a foundation that was already cracking. The next years would show just how quickly dreams could fall apart under the pressure of politics, betrayal, and war. At first, the empire seemed to be strong, with French soldiers and well-trained European officers. Maximilian's rule spread across Mexico. Imperial and French armies captured important forts in the west, taking control of Sinaloa and Jalisco, and raised the emperor's flag over cities that were once loyal to the Republic. To people watching from other countries, it looked as if Mexico was becoming stable under its new crown. Maximilian rode at the front of parades with Carlotta by his side, showing themselves as kind rulers. In Mexico City, big events mixed European fancy style with Mexican traditions. People in the court announced a new golden age, and French newspapers wrote nice stories about the Habsburg prince bringing civilization to a chaotic land. For Napoleon III, it was a victory, proof that his risky plan was working. But away from the public squares and palaces, the empire's winds were not solid. Outside the cities, in the mountains and villages, the Republican fight never stopped. Juárez and his government, still in Chihuahua, sent out messages that spoke against the foreign throne. Guerrilla fighters attacked French supply lines, ambushed convoys, and disappeared back into the rough countryside. Whole communities, even though they were too weak to fight the imperial soldiers in a big battle, gave food and shelter to these fighters, keeping the fight alive. The empire's growth showed another problem. Wherever Maximilian's modern changes were felt, like ending peonage or limiting forced labor, they caused trouble among his conservative supporters. Landowners and church leaders complained that the emperor was destroying the very things that kept order. The poor farmers liked the new rules but did not trust the foreign king who signed them. Maximilian found himself in a lonely spot, too liberal for the old-fashioned people who had invited him, and too much of a king for the Republicans who fought against him. But through 1865, the French army's training and firepower kept the empire together. In Europe, Napoleon's reputation seemed safe. In Mexico, Maximilian convinced himself that time would fix the problems, that Mexicans would one day accept him not as a foreign ruler, but as their rightful king. But history was moving quickly. Across the northern border, the great American Civil War was coming to its bloody end. And once that storm was over, the winds would turn against Maximilian's weak empire with terrible force. While French soldiers marched through Mexico's valleys and Maximilian held court in Chapultepec Castle, the northern sky was burning with another war. From 1861 to 1865, the United States was busy with its own civil war, the deadliest fight in its history. For Napoleon III, that chaos was a gift. The United States, busy and broken, could not enforce the Monroe Doctrine. This was its long-held warning that no European empire should get involved in the Americas. But in April 1865, the guns of the American Civil War finally went silent. The Union came out hurt but not broken, and President Andrew Johnson, like Lincoln before him, was determined to show U.S. power again. In Washington's political groups, Mexico was no longer a faraway issue, but a problem that needed to be solved now. A French-backed kingdom on America's southern border was not acceptable. Almost right away, American policy changed. The Union Army, which was full of experienced soldiers and supplies, moved units to the Rio Grande River. U.S. diplomats sent strong warnings to Napoleon. The empire in Mexico was against the Monroe Doctrine, and America would not just watch. The United States did not declare war yet, but the message was clear: leave or face a fight. Support for Juárez started to come in. Shipments of rifles, bullets, and money crossed into northern Mexico. Republican fighters who had struggled for years with very few resources suddenly had American Springfield rifles and modern cannons. With this new strength, Juárez's cause came back to life. For Maximilian, the timing could not have been worse. His empire was already struggling, its right to rule was questioned, and its changes were disliked. Now, the shadow of the United States hung over every decision. The empire that had seemed safe with French protection was starting to look like a weak illusion. For Napoleon III, the situation was changing. What had once been an easy risk, taking Mexico while America was busy, was becoming a dangerous problem. France now faced the chance of angering not only Mexican Republicans but also a newly reunited superpower. The dream of a Latin empire in the New World was starting to fall apart. By 1866, the direction of the war had changed. 4 years, Juárez's Republican armies had survived on pure toughness alone, with scattered fighters, torn uniforms, and old muskets. But now, with American rifles and money coming across the Rio Grande, the Republic was reborn. Veterans of the Union Army trained Mexican soldiers while truckloads of supplies helped the resistance. What had once been a desperate fight became a well-planned counterattack. Republican armies moved quickly, taking back towns and areas that had seemed lost to the empire. Cities in the north rose again under the tricolor flag of the Republic, and guerrilla groups across the countryside attacked more often. French patrols were ambushed on mountain roads. Convoys disappeared in flames. Outposts were taken over in the night. The mood changed. The French soldiers, tired from years of occupation, began to feel that their mission was pointless. Maximilian's imperial soldiers, the Mexican conservatives who had once dreamed of getting their old power back, now faced a strong enemy with American support. Victory, which once seemed sure, now slipped through their fingers like sand. In Europe, the pressure grew on Napoleon III. The United States stood strong, demanding that the French leave. At home, the war had become unpopular, using up men and money for a cause that few people in France really cared about. Napoleon had gone into Mexico looking for glory. By 1866, it had become a big mess, threatening his own reputation. He reluctantly ordered the French soldiers to start leaving. For Juárez, it was a victory. For Maximilian, it was a betrayal. The foreign emperor who had been promised France's endless support now found himself more and more alone, his throne held up only by a shrinking number of loyal Mexican imperial soldiers. Still, Maximilian refused to give up his throne. He convinced himself that his changes, his ideas, and his own bravery could keep the empire together. But the Republic was no longer a small light in the dark. It was a fire spreading across Mexico, and soon Maximilian would have to face it directly. By the end of 1866, the dream that Napoleon III had created in Paris was in ruins. The French withdrawal had seriously begun. Soldiers that once marched proudly through Mexico City now marched to Veracruz, getting on ships heading home. Cannons were taken apart, flags were folded, and the lines of soldiers that once stood for imperial power now looked like a retreat. For Napoleon, the decision was a cold, smart one. France could not afford to make the United States angry, as its armies now stood guard along the Rio Grande. Pressure at home was also growing. Critics in Paris complained about the cost. Soldiers' families cried for the dead, and the emperor's reputation was getting weaker. What was supposed to be a great victory for France had become an embarrassing diplomatic problem. By cutting his losses, Napoleon hoped to save his reputation in Europe, even if it meant leaving behind what he had created in Mexico. For Maximilian, the news was crushing. The emperor, who had crossed an ocean with the promise of endless French support, was now betrayed. His empire, which was never truly safe, was falling apart under him. But when his helpers told him to give up the throne and go back to Europe, Maximilian refused. To leave, he said, would be a dishonor to the men who had fought and died for him. Maybe more than that, it would dishonor the picture he had created of himself, a reforming king chosen by fate, loyal to his new nation. Carlotta, desperate to save the throne, sailed back to Europe to beg Napoleon and the other European courts for help. She begged for aid, saying that Maximilian's empire could still survive. But in Paris, no one listened to her pleas. In Vienna, her family told Maximilian to leave Mexico. Overwhelmed and exhausted, Carlotta had a mental breakdown that made her unable to return. The emperor was now truly alone. By early 1867, Maximilian's empire was an empire in name only. French soldiers were gone, European support had disappeared, and Republican armies were closing in from all sides. But Maximilian, stubborn and romantic until the end, decided to keep fighting. He moved to the city of Querétaro, gathering the last of his loyal supporters, getting ready to make his final stand. In the spring of 1867, the city of Querétaro became the last hiding place of a falling empire. Behind its walls, Maximilian gathered the last of his supporters, a few thousand imperial Mexican soldiers, some conservative officers, and the ghost of an empire that had once reached from Veracruz to Jalisco. Outside, Republican armies tightened their circle, their numbers growing with each week. 4 months, the siege went on. Hunger bothered soldiers and regular people. Sickness spread through the narrow streets. But Maximilian refused to leave the city. He walked among the trenches in his white uniform, talking with the regular soldiers, telling them that help would come. To many of his soldiers, this stubborn emperor, who was born in another country but was sharing their suffering, earned some respect. But respect could not change what was going to happen. In May, a betrayal decided his fate. A Mexican officer on the imperial side opened the gates to the Republicans. Querétaro fell. Maximilian, who had crossed an ocean dreaming of a great destiny, was taken prisoner. Juárez, who was firm in his support for the Republic, now had to make a serious decision. The world watched to see if the captured emperor would be spared or punished. European courts begged for him to be shown mercy. Even Empress Carlotta, broken by madness in Europe, could no longer fight for him. Juárez would not change his mind. Mexico had suffered for too long and had been humiliated too many times. To let Maximilian live, he worried, would leave the door open for another empire, another foreign invasion. A court sentenced him to death. On the morning of June 19, 1867, Maximilian stood on a hillside outside Querétaro, with two loyal generals, Tomás Mejía and Miguel Miramón, by his side. He faced the firing squad with calm dignity, offering gold coins to the soldiers and asking them to aim at his heart. "I forgive everyone," he declared. A round of rifle shots rang out, and the dream of a Habsburg Mexico ended in smoke. With Maximilian's death, the Republic was brought back. Juárez returned to Mexico City not as someone on the run, but as president, proven right by history. For France, the invasion was a humiliation that damaged Napoleon III's reputation. For Mexico, it was a victory paid for with blood, a reminder that the nation's freedom could not be decided by other countries. And so ended one of the strangest wars of the 19th century. It was a clash of empires and republics, of ideas and dreams, of ambition and resistance. From it came a Mexico that was hurt but not broken, and an emperor remembered not as a conqueror, but as a tragic man who chased his destiny across the sea, only to meet his end in front of a Mexican firing squad.